Hi, this is Lynn Sautter Beal of Upstart, and welcome to Leaders in Lending. I will be joined today by Chris Berry. Chris serves as the president and CEO of OhioX, a statewide nonprofit working to build Ohio into a tech hub. OhioX is a member based organization with representation from Fortune 500 companies, universities, research organizations, startups, and tech focused businesses. The work of OhioX centers around connecting, promoting, and advocating for tech and innovation in Ohio. Let's get started. All right. Hi, Chris. Thanks for joining me today on Leaders in Lending. So we're going a slightly different direction with today's podcast, a bit more tech and industry focused, and a little bit less focused on lending. So I'm excited for our chat today.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Lynn. Big fan of you and the Upstart team. And yeah, just don't ask me any overly technical questions and we should be in good shape.
Absolutely. I think Chris, like you have a really interesting background, and like honestly, so many of the people I've had on the podcast as guests, you spent some time in politics, both in DC and Ohio prior to your current role. Can you talk me through kind of your career path and
Sure.
what led you to leading OhioX?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so my background, as you mentioned, isn't really technology, but I worked in government. So I started my career in DC and then left. And if we're talking finance, I was at the state treasury in Ohio for 8 years. And I grew up always with a kind of a passion for government and policy. And, I love shows like The West Wing and, kind of history books and all of that. And so that's what I thought I wanted to do. And that was kind of my goal when I was growing up and in college, would move to Washington and work in that space. Kind of quickly realized I didn't love living on the East Coast. I didn't really love, the big city of Washington, D.C., not quite like New York, but still a pretty big metro area. And so wanted to come home. And that's when moved back closer to family and started working at the state treasury. And I think kind of government service is a very fascinating vantage point, especially for what I'm doing now, is because when I was at the state treasury, we started doing more and more technology focused projects. Most people don't think of innovation in government, just like they don't necessarily think of technology in Ohio. And so it's kind of an interesting parallel between the two. But one of which was we made Ohio the first state to accept Bitcoin tax payments. And this was a number of years ago at this point, and it was, I think, the third government in the world that did this. And so that was an interesting space. But we were working with a fintech in Atlanta to make it possible. Had a couple other interesting tech projects that were really fascinating to me. And we could see the impact where we'd work with, for instance, Silicon Valley based startups. And then through that process, we were asking ourselves, well, why are we working with fintechs in Atlanta and Silicon Valley based startups? And what does the tech landscape look like in Ohio? And when you work in government, you end up working across sectors, across industries, largely working with the statewide industry group. So it could be like the Ohio Bankers League or the Ohio Farm Bureau, groups like that. But tech historically in Ohio hasn't had that same type of statewide industry coalition that could work to connect and promote and advocate. And so, long story short, after leaving government, spending time in the private sector, a group of entrepreneurs and myself saw this need and kept seeing just an opportunity to make an impact. And we slowly but surely put this OhioX idea together, and just a band of volunteers came together to make it happen. And here we are today.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I did not realize that Ohio was the first state to accept
Yeah.
Bitcoin for tax payments. I've never attempted to pay my taxes via Bitcoin, but I was also surprised this week. I saw an article that the first write up by Satoshi on crypto was actually 14 years ago,
Yeah.
which surprised me. It feels like it's more current than that, but 14 years is not brand new. So I think a lot of our listeners are going to be surprised by the fact that Ohio led the charge there. So really, like Ohio, actually, you were saying, it came about just kind of a group of both people in the public sector, entrepreneurs, different folks got the idea. When was that? How long has OhioX been around in the state, and what do you really see as the primary goals and the what the organization wants to accomplish?
Yeah. So we launched in December of 2019. And as I mentioned, it was a group of volunteers, entrepreneurs. I was the only person actually that had a government and policy background. And so as we were thinking of, hey, there are some challenges that we repeatedly hear, and that was largely, we have to do better at promoting the tech industry in Ohio, pre-COVID especially. People didn't think of this as a destination for technology. And that's just not the case. As you know, there's incredible companies and people and ideas. The second kind of challenge or frustration that a lot of people were mentioning was we have a really big state, and Ohio's just geographic makeup is quite unique in that we're more like California and Texas and Florida, and that we have three really big metro areas: Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati, that are spread out. Whereas you look at like a Chicago, Illinois, an Atlanta, Georgia, a New York, a Boston, Massachusetts, most states typically have one really big metro area where all the tech is concentrated. And then the rest of the state is, kind of has different industries and sectors. And so in our state, we're spread out, which makes it really difficult. But if you think of the Bay Area, where Upstart is headquartered, it's not a single city. It's not like Manhattan, where all the financial companies are largely in Manhattan. It's from Berkeley to Palo Alto and everywhere in between. And if you were to drive through that, that wouldn't be a lot of fun to go from the north end of the bay to the south end and make a big loop. But that's really no different than Ohio in that you look at our state, and if you look at financial services, there is incredible companies in all of our major metro regions, and we're connected by an easy highway system. And so, in a lot of ways, it's just kind of taking something that is so simple of thinking of this as a statewide tech opportunity. Again, financial services is a perfect example, and making it easier to connect, promote, and advocate. And so that's what we do today. As I mentioned just quickly, we launched in December of 2019, all volunteers. COVID hit like 2 or 3 months later. And so if there's ever a good time to start a nonprofit trade association that's about bringing people together, doing it at the beginning of a global pandemic that we've never lived through is a really awful time to do it. And so we kind of paused for a little bit. And so technically we're about 4.5 years old, but really we're probably about 2 or 3, because we kind of had to, just figure out what the world was going to be in the middle of COVID, like everyone. But we pivoted really quickly into the digital, the virtual, kind of the online community, which makes sense for technology, and remote companies get that. And it really opened up a world of opportunity where it helped people see, and it helped accelerate our work in that, hey, if I'm in Cleveland, I can just as easily connect with someone virtually in Columbus and Cincinnati and Dayton and Toledo and Akron and Canton and Youngstown, as I can someone in my own backyard now. And so COVID very much accelerated our work. And our pillars are connect, promote, and advocate. So connect the people, the companies, the ideas, celebrate, promote it, make sure that we're telling the story of Ohio successes, and Upstart's story is one of those leading ones. And then advocate for it. There's so much space, especially in a regulated industry, you all know, of the relation between industry and government. And that's something that we're kind of filling this void for the first time in our state.
Sure. And I definitely think you talked about the size of Ohio and that we're connected by the highway system. I think that's a common kind of maybe joke about the Midwest that, we just get in the car and drive wherever we need to go. 14 hours, it's fine. 7 hours, it's around the corner. But it is true that, Ohio is a very large state. I think it's a larger state than many people realize. But it is drivable, and you drive between the three C's, as we often call them, and there's a lot of different interesting industry happening in each of the major cities. I think some of the listeners probably have not heard how we've been describing Ohio over the past several years, and much of the Midwest, but the Silicon Heartland phrase, it's kind of a fun play on Silicon Valley and farmland and the heartland of the country. What do you think makes really the Silicon Heartland and Ohio, but really the Midwest, have really so much promise as we grow, that's becoming such a kind of additional center of tech and innovation?
Yeah, and for those that haven't heard that Silicon Heartland phrase before, that was really born out of Intel coming to Ohio, where a couple years ago at this point, Intel made an announcement that for our state is transformational, because we have never had a semiconductor industry in Ohio. And so when that came to be, Intel's CEO and some others started playing with that phrase Silicon Heartland, like Silicon Valley. And it's really caught hold. And I think it shows the promise, the potential, but also just the passion of the technologists across Ohio at companies from Fortune 500s to startups and everything in between, that have kind of used that phrase as like a bit of a rallying cry. And I like that it's not about one city. It's where does the heartland start and end? So there's a lot of people that can take pride in that. And so, in terms of what is the kind of the Midwest, the Ohio specific opportunity, I think in a lot of ways, well, one, it's quite big in its areas in our state of excellence that we have a long, rich tradition in. And so, financial services, insurance, agriculture, manufacturing, industry 4.0, advanced manufacturing, healthcare. Those are all areas that our state, especially, really excels in. And whether you're in Northeastern Ohio, Central Ohio, Southwestern Ohio, for as diverse as our state and region is, the sectors and industries are all really, really similar. I think they also happen to be areas that really, frankly, matter. I jokingly, like to say that I don't know if the next TikTok is going to be built and born in Ohio, but banks and financial services that allow people to transact and get money for lending and grow companies, that takes place here. Insurance, that is something that we have a fantastic pillar in. Again, healthcare, where better place in the world to come for healthcare than Ohio? You have the Cleveland Clinic on one end of the state with university hospitals and Metro Health. You have Ohio State Wexner Medical Center in Columbus, and Cincinnati. Cincinnati Children's has been ranked the #1 children's hospital in the U.S. And so people literally fly to Ohio from across the world for healthcare. And so we have these, really pillars of excellence that are incredible sectors, industries that matter and are important. And that's the Ohio tech opportunity. And then if you think about kind of beyond that, I think in a lot of ways, we have to seize this for America in some ways, because we've seen what reshoring or what taking companies abroad has done. I grew up in Northeastern Ohio and Akron,
Mhm.
which is the rubber capital of the world historically. Goodyear and Firestone were there. My family is there because of that industry, and what that has done to places like Ohio and other states when those jobs go overseas. Well, we all kind of know the geopolitical trends of what's just happening in the world and how complicated that is. So COVID kind of created these opportunities, and Intel and others are deciding to make things that really matter and that are, so strategically important right here. And so we're kind of capturing these opportunities for the first time in a long time. And our friends at Jobs Ohio like to call it a generational opportunity, where we haven't seen this type of momentum and opportunity capture before. And so hopefully we can take advantage of it, which I think we are, but that work isn't done by any means.
Yeah, I think the Intel piece has been super interesting,
Mhm.
and then kind of what's followed on beyond that. I think lately we've been talking about the mega loads as they're bringing
Yep.
supplies in to build that Intel plant, and the amount of planning that goes on and just transporting the raw materials that they need to start building that facility is really significant. It's a good point you made about the kind of the rubber industry and the
Mhm.
various industries, and really across Ohio and much of the Midwest of what became the Rust Belt. And I grew up an hour north of Columbus in a small town, and had a number of industries: Mansfield Tire, Ohio Brass, AK Steel. So a lot of that kind of core industry that used to exist in the Midwest, and certainly watched that move away, and watched my parents' friends lose their jobs, and have to retrain to do new things, whether they were working at a factory or in a management level. And my parents both actually had the opportunity to train people overseas as part of that, being on the management side of it. So it is really exciting, I think, to see this amount of development and growth. And I've lived in Ohio my entire life and have not seen this amount of positive change until recently. So we've definitely seen the data centers come in, like the Meta, Google, and AWS has some cloud centers here. What do you think makes really Ohio, or just even the Central Ohio region, uh, uh, the right opportunity for them? Like, what do you think is do you think there's just some a little bit of FOMO now that everyone's there? It makes sense, but kind of what's bringing them here, and what do you see that as creating opportunities for employees, especially kind of new younger people entering the employment market? Like, what will that mean for them as they try to define and develop careers?
Yeah, and so I think with the data centers, a couple of the things that we've heard, and those companies you mentioned are great partners and members of ours as well. Um, a lot of it's land, where Central Ohio, we don't have. It's a great place to live, but we don't have the mountains, we don't have the beaches, those types of things. So there's And also Columbus is just historically like a younger town. It's people like you and me moving here from, north of
Hmm.
Columbus by an hour. I'm northeast of Columbus by 2 hours. And so Columbus has really had this population growth from other parts of the state over the years. And so we don't have the mountains, we don't have the rivers like a Cincinnati does, or the lake like Cleveland. And as a younger city, we just have had a lot of land. And so land, energy, there's incredible energy, kind of energy environment here. AEP and others that just, the data centers, they needed the energy, of course. And so there's some of those pieces. I think there's also a lot of business leadership that helped pave the way for this. There's groups like Jobs Ohio, again, that are out there aggressively recruiting and kind of going after some of these really big opportunities for our state. There's also groups like the Columbus Partnership, which is a coalition of the largest businesses in Central Ohio that have been laying the groundwork for like this for many, many years. It's not something that just, happened. I think that's one of the stories that, certainly you all know, and the Upstart story has been part of that. But I think sometimes people
Hmm.
just think these opportunities come, but largely it's leadership that, they're taking things again, like the land and the energy. Well, people could kind of just stop there, but, that they set the stage of, placing, strategic bets that helped attract these. And so it's been fantastic to see over the past just 5 years or so, where these companies are really coming in droves. And this hasn't, as you know, also being from Ohio, like these opportunities haven't always occurred to our state. And when you can have a map of the state with logos like Intel and Google and Meta and AWS and Microsoft and Honda and LG and their $4 billion electric vehicle plant, and Ford and their EV plant in northeastern Ohio. I mean, these are literally multi-billion-dollar investments that are adding up. And talk about a powerful signal where I remember when Intel broke ground on the state, I had the opportunity to go. The president flew in, and CNBC and
Hmm.
Squawk on the Street, they were broadcasting live from the announcement and the site. And so, we're in these headlines with global names, and people have to notice and pay attention. And I think there's a real opportunity here that is happening and being seized because of a lot of great leaders that have been laying the groundwork for this for a long time.
Yeah, I think Ohio surprises a lot of people. I know you mentioned Upstart when we opened our offices here. As the leadership of the company and the headquarters was in San Mateo, so in the Bay Area, was looking for, actually it was in San Carlos at that point, and not moved to San Mateo, but we're looking for that second headquarters location. Ohio hit all of the boxes, and I think once that decision was made, it was about 90 days until there were people on the ground in an office in Columbus, and we've only really grown since then. And while we are primarily remote, and we maintain our offices here and spend a lot of time in them, so it's been a great location for us. And I think that it's been super interesting as we have people come in from around the country who may not have traveled here, may not have been in Ohio. They are always surprised how much they like Columbus. Like, wow, this is really walkable. There's all these great restaurants. I can walk to the hotel. There's so many interesting things to do. It's a variety of people. And so I think for those of us who are big champions of the Midwest and champions of Ohio, it's definitely validating to show it off, and to have everyone see what we see here. But I think, of course, everything's not always perfect, not always roses. What are some of the obstacles that maybe you hear or you see, as you or Jobs Ohio or the various organizations are working to encourage new companies to come to the state? What sort of things are you hearing that are maybe obstacles to them choosing the Midwest versus wanting to be on the coast, or in a larger metropolitan area?
Yeah, definitely. I would say there's kind of two big ones: capital and talent, which very much makes sense. But to kind of dig into both of those, on the capital side, Ohio and really anywhere outside of San Francisco, Boston, New York, that's where the vast majority of venture capital dollars just flow. And Ohio, I think last year got like 1% of national funding, which for a state that is the eighth largest, I believe, in terms of population, with all these big industries, I think we have 54 Fortune 1000 companies. So very clearly there a very large base of potential sales opportunities for startups. We are still not attracting and kind of earning the venture capital investment dollars and kind of a larger share of the pie than we should. So that's an area that's not anything necessarily new. And I think now, as you mentioned, a lot of startups, especially younger tech companies, are typically remote first, or maybe they have like a couple people at their quote unquote headquarters, but then they have 75% of their team in other places. And so I think COVID has in some ways helped the opportunity for not being in San Francisco or not being in Boston if you're a life sciences or biotech company. Um, but that is still a really, really big struggle. And so that is an area that we just have to do better. And there's a lot of smart people, working on that and trying to, change that for the better. And we're hopefully playing a small role in that too. On the other side, talent, where Ohio, just as a state, our population isn't growing like a lot of southern and western states. Columbus, where Upstart is HQ'd in our state, and where we both live, as you were mentioning, there's a really vibrancy and growth to it, but it's because of people like me that grew up in northeastern Ohio and move here. And so the typical kind of Ohio story is you go to whatever Ohio University, whether it's literally Ohio University or Ohio State or Miami or some others. And then a lot of students will go off to Chicago or they'll go off to New York. I went to the East Coast myself, and I came back a couple years later. But we have a ton of universities, a ton of community colleges, but we also export a lot of talent. And so I think there's some population challenges and just in terms of keeping that talent. And that is one where if you ask a college grad that's maybe a computer science major or something else in that space, they want to go where the jobs are, and they want to go to companies like Upstart and others. And so the volume there of companies like Upstart when it was a non-IPO'd company, as a Series A, Series B, Series C. Those are the exciting opportunities that especially younger college grads that are in this tech space want to go after. And so a lot of them, again, because of that venture capital kind of chicken or the egg, which is the real key, will leave and again go to a much bigger city, leave the state. What we find is that oftentimes a good chunk of them want to come back, Ohio boomerangs, but we have to make it easier by hopefully building up more companies that make it a really simple decision where, hey, it's not just one or two companies they could potentially work at that are really exciting and tech focused, and really leaders in innovation. But how do you multiply that? And there's all sorts of good groups like the Ohio Angel Collective and a few others out there that are doing work in this space to hopefully help with that funding side. But I think it's talent and capital is largely some of the big challenges.
Yeah, that's a great point because I think as you're, if you're kind of growing up in Ohio, and particularly if you're in one of the more like rural areas, which much of the state is outside of
Yep.
the three major cities, you may just not know what is out there, and so you think about tech, and all you hear about is Silicon Valley, or you think about banking, and you hear about New York, and you don't really know what is available locally. I think that OhioX, you guys do a great kind of tech education tech day in the fall that is aimed at really exposing that to high schoolers. Can you talk a little bit about that, and how I think your organization is really helping expand that and build that desire to stay local and to think about staying in the state and keeping your talents here versus moving?
Yeah, absolutely. So our group, as we've been discussing, we're an industry organization, but one of the interesting things that's come out of our work that we didn't necessarily expect was a couple things. One is, well, the known knowns of, we knew that the talent side was something that our companies and just the tech sector was really passionate about. And so as we've gotten deeper into that work, I kind of think that there's kind of two pieces of the talent. There's like the universities, the higher education. There's a lot of great work happening there. There's also a lot of movement around the reskilling and upskilling, and I think that's a fantastic thing. Whether it's like tech apprenticeships or helping
Mhm.
companies maybe at some of the larger, think of a grocery store chain of how do they take someone that maybe has been a cashier or a bagger or a stock shelfer, that knows the industry, because they're actually there, they're interacting with customers. But how do you move them perhaps into career trajectory opportunities? And so there'll kind of be a lot of reskilling or upskilling initiatives, which are fantastic. Where I think there's been a bit of a void, and really more of an opportunity, is in the K through 12, because largely if we just wait for students to self-select that they're going to go to Ohio State or Case Western or Miami or the University of Cincinnati, and then self-select that they're going to go into computer science, and then self-select that they want to go into a tech career, like, we've already lost out on 95 or 99.9% of potential tech workers, because you just don't know it's an option, or a lot of students, don't have the opportunities that other students have, that they can get into tech careers. And so that K through 12 space has been really interesting, because the earlier we can help expose that there are these opportunities, that there are tech companies here, that there are tech opportunities here, is a really, really powerful thing. And so with our members, we about 3 years ago started this initiative called Ohio Tech Day. As simple as it is, it's about inspiring students to consider and explore innovation careers. And where it's kind of been morphing is really connecting schools at the local level, connecting schools and tech companies, where they can build relationships, actively. And that can be through, career days, that can be school visits into the companies going to visit schools. There's a big push around high school tech interns in the state. And so building those relationships, because what we found is largely the tech companies we work with didn't necessarily have relationships with their local school districts or education centers. And then at the school level, we all know how difficult it is for things like school funding and others. But oftentimes there was just a lot of entrepreneurial teachers that saw the need to help provide their students with tech and innovation kind of inspiration or opportunities, but they didn't necessarily, have a background as a computer science teacher. They certainly weren't a technologist by training. They were maybe a science teacher or even just a social studies teacher. And so they kind of took it upon themselves to just create some of these opportunities. And so it's held annually on the final Friday in September, and it's about, again, inspiring students to consider innovation careers, but really about connecting schools and tech companies at the local level, so they can build relationships that hopefully, create opportunities for things like internships, career exploration, and just inspiration. Because again, if we wait till someone's a computer science graduate at a 4-year university, there are a whole host of potential, amazing tech professionals out there that we just will never get to meet, because it's just, it's not like going to a restaurant. You want to be a chef, or going to a dentist or a doctor. You wanted to be a dentist or doctor. A lot of tech people just sit behind a computer and do a lot of work. And so there's not necessarily that kind of welcome sign to make it easy to figure out how you might want to be someone who works in a technology career field.
Yeah, and definitely, I think if you don't have somebody in your family or your
Yep.
immediate circle who does, I think it's hard to maybe understand what those careers are. So, like as you said, it's very easy. Everyone knows what a dentist does. Everyone knows what a doctor does. There's a lot of jobs where there's a single word that can describe them, and I think in the tech industry, particularly, there's so many roles that are not as easily described. I know personally, if I talk about my job, and we joke that we should have a podcast where we have all of our parents come on and explain what we do for a living, or have our kids come on for that
Yeah.
matter and explain what we do for a living, and see how that episode goes.
Yeah.
So
I'll
that
join
may
you
be
on
a
that
future
one,
one.
because I get a lot of that too.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell us what Lynn does for a living,
Right.
and we can all be entertained by that. But
Yep.
I think particularly in Columbus, but even in the Cleveland and Cincinnati both have some regional banks headquartered there.
Mhm.
We've got really some large big banking centers here in Columbus. J.P. Morgan has over 20,000 employees. Wells Fargo recently opened up a technology center and is making Columbus part of their geographic footprint. Do you see that as really helping build talent and kind of expanding those types of tech roles that people could have in the state?
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, we're spread out, as we've discussed, and we have all these metro areas. And so I think that sometimes the kind of, piecing that together. And Columbus is a perfect example with JP Morgan and Upstart and Wells Fargo and Huntington. I mean, there is a large financial services presence. I think, and I should know this stat, but I think Ohio has the third or the fourth largest financial services sector in the United States. And so even for our kind of population being about the eighth largest state, we very much outpace when it comes to financial services, just the base that we have here. And of course, that means employees. And so, I think that is a huge opportunity, especially if we think of younger companies, whether they're startups that are 0 to 1 built in Ohio, or hey, how do we perhaps recruit more startups from the Bay Area and others, New York, that maybe want to replicate the Upstart story, where they open up a second office and come to a place like Columbus, because everything from access to customers to a talent base that has worked at large financial institutions, we have those. And I think, again, your company is that perfect example of that we really probably need to do a better job of telling that and shouting that, and trying to be active in recruiting more, because again, you all have literally lived it. And so there's no better story. And I love when I get to hear team members of yours, or read stories about Upstart, because that is exactly what I think the Ohio opportunity is. It's in a space where we have a deep expertise, a deep knowledge, a deep talent base, and we should be trying to do more of that. And so I love the financial services space, and I think it is an opportunity, especially when you think about tech, that is very much untapped. And there's a lot of activity in some of those other pillars of excellence, like manufacturing, and Intel being the biggest example. Again, some of the Honda and LGs and their manufacturing. So there's a lot in that. Healthcare has these giant innovation districts, that our state is making large investments in, anchored around, again, groups like the Cleveland Clinic and University Hospitals and Cincinnati Children's and the universities. But I think kind of financial services is still that one untapped one. And so there's probably some work to do there that we could all collaborate on, because I think it is a massive opportunity for the state for sure.
Well, I'm personally now even more pumped than I was before we talked about it. I think that the Upstart story in Ohio has been fantastic. We've had a really great experience here as a company, and I think one thing that I've found that is very unique, among technology companies, maybe in the Midwest compared to on the coast, is just how collaborative the companies are. Things like recommending talent, that maybe we know somebody who's looking for a role and isn't exactly the right fit for us, or we don't have the right opportunity. I know our recruiters work closely with recruiters at other companies. We may refer them in, say, hey, this is a really great candidate, but it's not the right spot for us. Company wide, do you want to interview this person? We'd really recommend them. And I think that has been a real benefit, as we've grown since 2019, here locally, that we can find top talent, and hopefully both elevate the talent in the industry, but also partner really closely with so many other great firms locally. I think we've certainly talked about a variety of things as it relates to Ohio and the Midwest, but any kind of hot takes from you on kind of the state of tech, and what you see coming in the Midwest, to
Yeah.
close things out?
Again, I think it's the areas that as simple as it is, it's almost a mindset around thinking of it as a regional opportunity, just like the Bay Area. And again, to drive around the Bay and go from downtown San Francisco to Cupertino and Mountain View and Palo Alto and Berkeley, that's a region. And I think, as simple as it is, that is something that our state can do a better job at, and that we're trying to work on. In terms of the Ohio opportunity, kind of moving forward, it's also, I think, somewhat simple. It's the areas that we happen to already excel in, financial services being a perfect case. As I mentioned earlier, it's also areas that matter. And so we have to be able to transact, and we have to be able to bank, and we have to be able to lend. We take care of people when they're sick with our healthcare institutions. We build things. We're building semiconductors now, which is really, really exciting. And so the more we can keep making investments and strategic, bets in those areas, I think we're just going to become even more and more important, especially as the world seems to get more and more complicated. And then another thing we didn't talk about, but just Ohio's geographic kind of place. We're in the Eastern time zone. If you draw kind of a circle around us, you can drive essentially to 60% of the U.S. population within about a day. And you were joking, anyone in the Midwest, did you hop in the car for 10 hours and you're at the beach, and that's what we do.
Mm-hmm.
But there's that. And then I also think, though, as the world, climate change and others, we are positioned right on the Great Lakes, and I think that is something that access to fresh water, just our geographic placement as a state, which has nothing to do with us, and but you can't replicate Great Lakes with fresh water,
Mhm.
and so some of those things that are only going to become more and more and more important. You mentioned the data centers. They're also here partially because of our weather, and we don't have hurricanes, we don't have earthquakes, we don't have forest fires. We do have tornadoes, but in the grand scheme, that's something that is probably something a little more easily defensible than others. And so, kind of, our weather, access to things like fresh water, are real opportunities, I think, for our state. That again, there's some really good people working on some theses around those and kind of making bets, but that's something that it's kind of literally, if you go up to Cleveland, it stares you in the face, this massive Great Lake.
Mhm.
But that's something that as the world gets more complicated, it's only going to become more important.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely interesting that natural resources are a driver of tech coming here. So kind of two very different things, but depend on each other. So well, great. I mean, I really appreciate the conversation, Chris. Thanks for joining us here on the podcast today.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Lynn.